Hello, this is Reverend Don Lewis coming to you from the beautiful metaverse, and more specifically from beautiful Danville, Illinois, homeland of the Corellian tradition. And today is Tuesday, and this is Midday with Reverend Don. I hope you're having a lovely day. As you know, if you follow Midday with Reverend Don, you can type your questions or comments on whatever platform you happen to be watching on. They'll show up here in my chat room. Chat room is on the screen since I have no guest today, and we can all share it together, and that will be great. And today, my subject is infrastructure, and I wanted to talk about infrastructure because I had a little problem with infrastructure myself last night. Um, if you're a member of my Patreon, you know I normally do a Monday night chat room. I've been doing that chat room since 1998, but I've been doing it on Patreon these last couple of years. And last night I was not able to do it because we were having some electric problems here at the house. And I was afraid that, I would be doing the chat room online, the electric would go out, might damage the computer, would certainly be inconvenient to everyone. So I decided it was better to take the cautious road of simply not doing the chat room last night. And I certainly miss doing it. I always love to see everyone, um, but I thought it was a wiser course of action to simply post a cancellation. Hello to Magical Mermaid, and Magical Mermaid says, "Wow, 1998. Yes, I've been doing the same chat room Monday nights at 8 since 1998." When I talk about continuing to do the right thing, I do practice that. Um, but what it turned out that happened, this is an old house. It's a very old house, actually. And I rather like living in old houses, but they come with their problems. And what happened was that we thought we had blown a fuse. But when we checked the fuses, they were all perfectly fine. And it took several hours to find out what actually had happened. And what happened is that what actually blew is what's called a circular fuse. And once we knew that, it was easy enough to correct it. But first we had to find it out. And yeah, so that's what happened. And when that circular fuse blew, about half of the electrical um, functions in the house shut down. There were no lights upstairs, for example. Um, and at various periods, the entire electricity would shut down for a few seconds, which is why I was hesitant to try to do the chat room, even though the computer was working. But I didn't want a failure in the middle. And I know that when that happens to a computer being shut down that way, it can be bad for it. So I thought that was the wise course of action. Now, in terms of talking about this today, um, this causes me to think about the fact of how important our infrastructure is to us on a regular basis. And if we look at the wider society, and we think about infrastructure, it shouldn't take us very long to see how important that is. Some of the things that we rely on society for in terms of infrastructure are our roadways. Not only their existence, but also keeping them clean during inclement weather, such as here in Illinois at present, we have a great deal of snow, and the various municipalities are theoretically clearing the roads. This is very important for people who are out driving and need to get places. Without that infrastructure, it would be a much more dicey situation. Um, Magical Mermaid says electrical technology infrastructure has been changing nationally, and this has been interesting uh, to them. And yes, electrical technology has changed greatly in my lifetime. And this house is still, in many ways, more what you would have seen when I was a young man. in terms of its electricity, or even a child, which is not what a modern house would be like. Um, and after so many years, that's a little hard to navigate. Um, it's a different kind of system. And I think about when I was growing up, my father still had many things which reflected the electrical technology of the 20s and 30s. And for example, he had a particular lamp, which I still own, a stained glass lamp from the 1920s that had been his as a child. And he had at one point rewired this by splicing the cord with a new one and then taping it with electrical tape, um, which was not an uncommon thing for him to do. I can't imagine the last time I actually saw someone do that. Nor do I think most people today would consider it to be an option. But it was a common thing then. Um, it's interesting, I remember in my uncle's house, when you went to turn on the lights, there was a push button, which was a common thing from the 20s and 30s. But in my generation, it was usually a toggle. And it's interesting to see how these little details have changed, but behind them, the larger details have changed drastically as well. Another thing you really notice being in an older house is how many less outlets you have than you would have in a modern house, because people used far fewer electrical appliances 50 years ago or 60 years ago than they do today. And in a modern house, you'll have a lot more places to plug things in on the premise that you're going to have a lot more things to plug in, ranging from your cell phone charger to your computers to any number of other items that you might have, which they would not have had. I've talked about how it can be hard sometimes to realize how these things have changed. I've talked about how years ago I was watching the movie Atomic Vampire, which is certainly one of the best, worst horror films ever made. And there's a scene where the heroine is running from the vampire. Or actually, no, the heroine is being stalked by the vampire, and her boyfriend is running to try to get to her in time to rescue her. And she's totally clueless as the vampire sneaks up on her. And I remember watching this and thinking, why don't you pick up the phone and call her and warn her? When it occurred to me, wait a minute, that was 1964. He would have had to have found a public phone and had change to use it to be able to give her a call. And that was not necessarily possible. And I realized at that moment that I had almost forgotten the era of public phones, even though I was no longer a young man when they ceased to be a thing. But I can remember when, if you needed to call someone and you were away from home, you needed a quarter or earlier a dime in order to make that call from a public phone. And if you find a public phone today, it's going to be a rarity. It will probably require a credit card instead of change. Um, Things change constantly, and it's important to stay on top of them. I can't imagine surviving today without a cell phone. I'm sure there are a few people who do, but they must be living very different lives. Um, and yet I went most of my life without one because they didn't exist. I can remember the first portable phones, which were the size of lunchboxes, except significantly heavier, and you had to carry them in your hand or have them mounted in your car. They were called. They were also called car phones because mounted in the car they could not be removed, but you had them when you were driving. I remember the early cell phones with antennas that were necessary, and it's been a lot of development very quickly, and that is normal for human life. If we look at my lifetime, which is the last 60 odd years, there have been a huge number of changes. And And Magical Mermaid says they should have converted all the public phones to emergency free phones, and yes, that would have been a good thing to do. But of course, they'd have made no money from it, so that's not what they did. Um, but in a better world, they might have done that. But when I think about the things that I have seen change in those 60 years and remember my childhood and how different certain things were, it's been a huge change. But then when I think about the 60 years before it, which because I was born to older parents who had many older relatives, I have a fairly good understanding of. They saw just as much change, maybe more, in the 60 years before that. And the truth of the matter is, you can go back for a long time and see constant, relatively rapid development happening. It doesn't seem as rapid as today's development, partly because we're used to all these things. When we think about something like the printing press, we are hard pressed to understand how revolutionary that was, um, and what a huge change it made to society because we're so accustomed to having easy access to books. Now, hello to Christine in the chat room. It's good to see you, Christine. Christine says, my washing machine turned itself on just after 3 a.m. in the morning the other day, and I couldn't get it to turn off without unplugging it. Um, I switched the outlet buttons before I could get it to run right. It's working fine now. Um, yeah, that would never have happened when I was a child. Um, our modern technology also comes with its own interesting challenges. But that does speak to how our infrastructure has changed. When I was a child, we actually had a perfectly good washing machine. I actually kind of wish I had that one now. And hello to Reverend Ed in the chat room. And I believe Reverend Ed, his father, is in need of prayers at this time. And I would ask you to take a moment when you have a chance to offer a prayer for Reverend Ed's father, who I believe is having surgery, um, or has had surgery, for his health and recovery. But getting back to when I was a child, we had a lovely um, washing machine for the clothes, but also in our house we had a mangle, an antique washing machine from 60 years earlier, where you had to feed the clothes in between the rollers by hand and turn the rollers by hand in order to scrub the clothes. And, it was a similar period of time between our modern electric washing machine and that mangle versus the time from my childhood to now. But, in 1900, the mangle was high technology. Many people were basically still boiling their clothes and scrubbing them either on a clothes scrubber, a washing board, or using a mangle. And they saw tremendous um, development during their lifetime. And we living today must understand that our children will see the same rapid development in the next 60 years. It is always ongoing. We don't tend to realize, and hello to Steve Taylor in the chat room, how much has developed because we take it for granted. We don't realize how revolutionary train travel was. Before trains, people actually thought that the human body would not physically stand up to going over 30 miles an hour. They were terrified that the people who took that first train ride would not make it safely to the end. Of course, they did, and then they had to rethink everything. And that drastically revolutionized how people traveled. Prior to trains, um, traveling took days or weeks that would later just take a few hours or a day or so at most. And this drastically changed the entire nature of the world. Um, it made it possible to travel great distances very quickly in a way that had never been possible before. And I don't think people today can really understand what life was like before we had these kinds of travel, whether we're talking about trains or automobiles, or for that matter, planes, although many people don't use planes even today. Um, but planes make it possible to travel still faster virtually anywhere in the world. And 60 years from now, surely there will be better ways of doing it still. One of the things that was pointed out to me some time ago by Ed the Pagan, who often points out unusual and interesting facts, is how revolutionary it was when reading became a thing, and that modern people really cannot imagine what it would have been like in a pre-literate society, because it has so greatly influenced how we look at the world and how we interact with the world, and I think that's true. Um, and Christine says, it's so interesting how the human adjusts and lives when we don't know the difference, and this is true. And very often, that's exactly what we do. We simply adjust to the changes. And this is both good and bad, because sometimes it causes us not to realize how far we've come. At other times, it allows us to accept exponential change with ease. And both of these are things for us to think about. And, I would say that if you yourself would take a few moments to think about the changes that have happened in your lifetime that you have simply adjusted to, you'll be amazed by how many there are. I've mentioned cell phones for myself, the coming of the computer. When I was young, we had no computers. Um, it it was a very different world. I remember when typing was considered technology. And I remember having some difficulty first becoming accustomed to using computers, because I had learned how to work both writing by hand and writing by typewriter in ways that were efficient for that technology that was no longer necessary on computer. And it took me a little while to realize that there were things I didn't have to think about using a computer, and things I could do on a computer I could never have done writing by hand. I used to take great pleasure and pride in the fact that I could make my handwriting um, resemble a typewriter. I could write very small and very neat. Um, and I can still do that, although I have very little occasion to write at all now, except for signing my books. Speaking of signing my books, we expect Reverend Don's book of Stones, Metals, and Crystals to become available, I would say, within the next week, more or less. It has taken longer for its final editing than was expected. And for those who are waiting for the Tarot of Hecate cards, I'm probably going to be sending out an update soon, but we're still waiting on them, and we had a problem in production relating to the box. I'll tell you honestly, I don't completely understand the problem, but it's been corrected, and they should be finished and on their way anytime. I think that we really are looking for a new producer for the cards in future. If you happen to know any card producers, feel free to suggest them. But we will have them here presently in the new year, and you will have them as quick as we can ship them to you from the time they arrive in our hands. And that's where we're at. And that too represents a change in technology, because I can remember when I first designed the Tarot of Hecate, the idea of printing your own deck, the idea of finding someone who could print that for you was simply not possible without a tremendous amount of money. And today we're looking at different possible printers because there are many of them. Now, Christine says, when I went back to school to get my master's degree, I needed to learn how to cut and paste on a computer before I could even begin to start a master's paper. And yes, this is true. Um, Computers are so much part of our life now that things like the school experience, I think from even the earliest grades, are influenced by it in a way that was not true in my day. Um, I remember when pocket calculators first came out, and so many educators were horrified by this and thought it was going to totally damage children's education. And today they're required, although usually within a phone. But this speaks to how we adjust. So when I talk about, as I so often do, that when it comes to metaphysics, it's not only a matter of passing along what has come down to us from the ages, but expanding upon it and enlarging upon it. This is something that we constantly do and we adjust to. Um, these things become second nature to us. And I think I was saying just yesterday, if we could go back and, which to some extent we can, look at the magic of the Hellenistic era, because it's fairly well documented, or other parts of the world at that same time period, we'd find many things that are familiar, but we'd find a great deal of difference also. And we take the differences in the much greater field we play on for granted. Um, so often I see people who want to limit that field without even having the understanding of how wide it is. And I strongly oppose that point of view. Um, Now, and hello to Reverend Michael in the chat room. The other thing I wanted to say about infrastructure is that infrastructure is very important to our communities, including our pagan community. And we do not have in the pagan community nearly the infrastructures that would really benefit us, but we have many that I don't think that most of us appreciate at all. Um, Infrastructures that we do have include all the different ways we communicate with each other over large distances. Um, Both our local groups, but also our many online contacts. And those online contacts give us an ability to communicate around the world that we did not have when I was young. And if we were to lose those, we would experience a great loss. And I think we need to be mindful of that. And as we go forward, we need to be making sure that we back up these abilities that we have to communicate. We have available online the equivalent of a vast library that no person could have put together when I was young with actual physical books. Um, what were once rare metaphysical books are now easily findable online. Um, and that has made a huge difference to what people know and what people do. We need to have an eye toward making sure that if we were to lose that infrastructure, we would still have those resources. We need to find ways to back these things up within our community. And we need to bear in mind that while technology is not going to go backwards, there are forces that could limit our access to certain things under the wrong circumstances, and we want to be prepared for that, even though hopefully no such thing will happen. But it's when you're not prepared that it does happen, and when you are prepared, you never have to worry about it. These are some of the things that I think about, and I hope you're thinking about too. And as we talk about our goals for a pagan city here in Danville, um, this kind of infrastructure is part of what we're talking about. We're talking about the servers to preserve our vast morgues of information from the many years we've been doing media. If our Magic TV/Corellian TV account at YouTube were suddenly gone, because we have been conservative and made sure that we had copies of all our videos, our work would not be gone. But do you have a YouTube channel, and can you say the same? If YouTube suddenly canceled you, would everything you did simply disappear? Ours will not, because I have carefully kept the original of virtually everything. This is true also from our many years on Blog Talk Radio with Pagans Tonight. We have been at great pains to preserve that legacy. I have boxes of artwork from before the computer age, and these are things that we have always taken great pride in preserving, and a lot of people have criticized us for it, and even tried to interfere with it over the years. But we think it's important to the future. Magical Mermaid says, I would love for you to create a book about referencing other important authors and books. And that actually might be a good thing. A couple of years ago, I was creating a reference for my son, John, of important metaphysical books. Both those that I owned, because this was before the dissolution of my library, but also the ones that they were referencing that I had never myself owned. It's a very wide range of books that do exist that many people aren't necessarily aware of, especially those older and more historical books. I had the very interesting experience. I follow a number of people on Instagram, and one of them, I follow the channel of Prince Stash, that's Stash de Rolla. And I found out one day that he wrote one of my favorite books on alchemy. And I had never realized that it was the same man until he was discussing having written it on his channel. And, alchemy is a wonderful subject of which there are thousands of books. But if you're not familiar with it, you don't realize the vast influence it has on modern Wiccan thought, and for that matter, modern New Age and pagan thought. Alchemy is very much alive, not only in its own right, but as an important part of other movements. The same for Hermeticism. More people are aware of Hermeticism. A lot of people dismiss alchemy as having been simply an early form of chemistry, and have forgotten that it had a strong spiritual element, and that they were using natural substances as a way of exploring spiritual thoughts. And Unique One, hello to Unique One in the chat room, says, the library at Casey's ARE in Virginia Beach is vast and amazing. Absolutely. And I hope that one day our great libraries are available to everyone online, because I think the more we share our knowledge, the happier we're going to be. Of course, not everyone thinks that way. And Christine says, do you have a suggestion on a good starting book on alchemy? Yes, the one I was just referencing. I believe it's called An Introduction to Alchemy by Stash de Rolla. And I think you can find it on Amazon. It is one that I would recommend. I think I may have reviewed it once here on Corellian TV when I was reviewing books in my library. And you might be able to find it that way as well. But I would look on Amazon. And it is a small and simple introduction to alchemy, which I think you might find helpful. And these are some of the things I would recommend for that. With that, we've come to the end of our half hour. I want to thank you for joining me. And it's time for us to have a word from our sponsors. Why? Because we love our sponsors. And here we go. ready to unlock the secrets of the universe? Join me, Rev Don Lewis, for my metaphysical and magic auctions at Gaia Thrift at whatnot.com. Discover fascinating artifacts, mystical crystals, and rare and unusual books that could change your life. Don't miss this chance to bring a little magic into your world. Rev Don's Metaphysical and Magic Auctions, where the extraordinary can become yours. And thank you to our sponsors, Equinox Learning Hub and Rev Don's Metaphysical and Magic Auctions. From Gaia Thrift, we are closed this week still for the New Year's holiday, and also in deference to the weather, we will be open next week, and we'll be bringing you information about our next auction as soon as we have set it. And I want to thank you for joining me today. I'll be back tomorrow, and I believe my guest will be Chris Copeland, and we'll be talking about what's new from Corellian Publishing. I think we'll have Chris tomorrow, and I hope that you have a lovely day, and until next time, may you be blessed. And let us close with our prayer, as we always do. Divine Mother Goddess, Divine Father God, beloved ancestors, we thank you for all that you do for us in our lives, and we ask you to help us to grow and to adjust to constant growth in life, to never become hidebound and unwilling to grow and expand, but always to enjoy this wonderful journey of life, and to adapt the many new things that come to us that are useful to us in our lives. Beloved Mother Goddess, beloved Father God, beloved ancestors, we thank you with great love. Knowing you're always with us from respect, we thank you for your presence, and may you be blessed now and always. May you be blessed now and always, and I'll see you again.